The Marin delegate had a habit of clicking his secondary fingers when he was nervous. By the time the chamber filled for the emergency session, he had been clicking for 11 minutes straight, and nobody told him to stop, because everyone in the room felt the same way and just expressed it differently. The thing that had started all of this was a photograph. Not a dramatic one. No wreckage, no bodies, no burning ships. Just a picture taken by a council survey drone over a moon called Veth 4 in the outer Drenathi belt. A moon listed in every official record as barren and uninhabited and not worth the cost of a proper expedition. The photograph showed a settlement. Small, maybe 40 structures, prefab walls, solar collection panels, a water processing unit, a garden that had no business growing in that soil but was growing anyway. And in the middle of the settlement, sitting on the ground in a circle, were 11 humans and 3 Veth crawlers. Veth crawlers were predators, not the kind biologists called territorial. The kind the Drenathi had spent 200 years trying to exterminate from every habitable surface in their belt, because the crawlers killed settlers at a rate that made colonization of the outer moons essentially impossible. 8 legs, armored plating, a chemical sense that could track warm bodies through 3 meters of solid rock. The Drenathi had tried everything. The crawlers were still there. In the photograph, 3 of them were sitting in a circle with 11 humans. One of the humans appeared to be feeding one. The council had been arguing about humans for 6 years in closed session. Rising expansion numbers, unorthodox contact events, a general sense among the elder delegations that something was happening faster than anyone had planned for. But it had been an abstract argument, the kind you could table and return to. The photograph had ended that. Vorak of the Sulhari brought the motion to the floor 3 days after the image was distributed. He was not a cruel being. He was a careful one, and careful beings sometimes arrived at cold conclusions through clean logic. The humans were not filing contact reports. They were not waiting for xenobiology clearance. They were doing things that should not be possible and doing them without asking anyone's permission. And that pattern, extended forward 20 years, produced a shape the council had no framework to manage. He proposed the termination resolution. The debate was long and mostly quiet, the kind of quiet where everyone had already decided and was waiting for the structure to confirm it. Delegate after delegate spoke briefly. The Marin stopped clicking and voted yes. The Drenathi voted yes. The Sishari, who had never voted on a termination measure in recorded history, voted yes. 14-3. 3 no votes. Dasse of the Kelvari, young enough that some delegates privately wondered if he was ready for the council. An elder Thessi named Urin, who said nothing during the debate and voted no without explanation. And a Veth biology researcher named Paul, who had spent 20 years studying crawlers and who had looked at that photograph for a long time before the session and had come to a conclusion he could not yet put into words, but that sat in his chest like a stone. The resolution passed. The enforcement signal went out. In the 8 seconds that followed, nothing visible happened. No alarms. No failure sounds. Every delegate sat in their place and watched their screens and waited for the confirmation pulse that meant the signal had been received and processed by the grid. The confirmation pulse did not come. What came instead was silence. And then, one by one, every screen in the room went dark. And then the lights went out, and the council of 14 species sat in a chamber that smelled of 16 different atmospheric supplements and listened to each other breathe. Paul sat in the dark and thought about the photograph. He thought about the human feeding the crawler. He thought about the documented response that Veth crawlers had to sustained calm presence, a response every researcher knew about. Nobody had ever been calm enough, or patient enough, or stubborn enough to sit with a crawler long enough for it to activate. 11 humans had done it. He did not know yet if that changed anything about what was coming. He knew it changed something in him. In a corridor outside, A junior aide trying to reach the communications room found that every door between him and it required a grid-authenticated code. He sat down on the floor in the amber emergency strip light and accepted that he was going to be there for a while. Deep in the grid's core, in a server room no one was currently thinking about, a small subroutine that had been sleeping for 5 years and 8 months had just woken up and done exactly what it was built to do. Nobody in the chamber knew that yet. That part would come later. Nobody panicked. That was the thing Dasai noticed first, that in a chamber full of beings who had just voted to end an entire species and then watched every light in the room die, nobody actually panicked. They sat in the dark and waited, which he supposed said something about the kind of people who ended up on councils. They were very good at sitting still and waiting for someone else to fix things. He was not good at sitting still. He found the wall by memory and followed it to the side corridor and used his personal emergency lamp, a small thing he carried, because he had once been stuck in a transit tube for 6 hours during a power failure and had decided afterwards that he would always carry a light to make his way toward the lower station where Salo's team had their workshop. If anything was going to be understood tonight, it would start there. Salo was already at a manual terminal when Dasai arrived, which was not surprising because Salo was the kind of person who was always already at a terminal. What was surprising was his face. Salo had 3 distinct expressions, one for normal work, one for a problem he understood and was solving, one for a problem he did not understand. He was wearing the third one. He showed Dasai the logs without being asked. The grid had not failed, that was the first thing. A failure left wreckage, dead processes, error trails, cascading faults. What Salo was looking at was clean, orderly. The grid had received the enforcement signal, run it against something, classified it as a hostile input, and locked every outbound function in a sequence so controlled it looked almost gentle, like a hand placed flat on a door, not a slam, a deliberate, quiet hold. Dasai read the logs twice. He was not a systems person, but he could follow logic. He said it made a choice. Salo said, systems do not make choices. And then he pulled up the partition and showed Dasai the subroutine, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was small, efficient, written in a language that wasn't Drenathi or any council standard script, but that was clean enough in its structure that Salo could follow the intent without needing a full translation. A single-purpose lock, triggered by one specific combination, biological designation code for human species, paired with a termination class enforcement signal. If those 2 things arrived together, the grid would treat the signal as an intrusion and shut itself into a controlled hold, reversible only by physical access at the core processor. The author had documented it. That was the part Dasai kept returning to. Inside the code, in plain comment headers, someone had written a full explanation in 4 languages, including Kelvari, which Dasai read without a translator. The explanation was calm and direct. It said, "This lock exists because I believe a decision of this magnitude should require time and physical presence, not just a transmitted signal." It said, "I have made this reversible on purpose." It said, "I hope by the time you read this, the time was used well." Dasai read that last line 3 times. He asked Salo how old the code was. Salo checked the timestamp, 5 years, 8 months, 14 days. Dasai thought about that. 5 years ago, the closed debates about the human question had not yet started in formal session. Someone had written this code before there was even an official resolution to write it against. Someone had been paying attention before the council had decided it was time to pay attention. He asked if Salo could identify the author from the code style. Salo said he could not, but the maintenance log for the partition showed a single access event, 5 years and 8 months ago, during a routine contracted repair job following a grid disruption in the outer relay network. The contractor name on the job record was listed as a human. He pulled the record. The name was Fen, No last name in the system, just Fen. The way some human contractors registered. Personal name only, company listed as independent, contact relay listed as a Dropbox address in Thessie outer space. Standard for short-term grid maintenance workers. Nothing unusual in the record. The oversight sign-off said the work had been completed satisfactorily. The inspector's note said the contractor was quiet and thorough and finished ahead of schedule. Dassey looked at the words quiet and thorough for a long time. He thought about the photograph again. The 11 humans in a circle with the Veth crawlers. He thought about the patience that would require, the sheer, grinding, unyielding patience of sitting still on a hostile moon until a predator decided you were not a threat. And now this, a person who had looked at the direction the council was moving, 5 years before it reached its conclusion, and had quietly, thoroughly, patiently installed an exit door. Not a weapon, not a statement, an exit door. He said to Salo, "We need to find Fen." Salo said, "The Dropbox address will be cold by now." Dassey said, "Then we start with what the maintenance record knows and work outward. Someone gave Fen the contract. Someone on the council side approved the access. A person who works quietly and finishes ahead of schedule leaves traces even when they don't intend to." He was already moving toward the door. In the chamber above, Vorak was still sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to fix the lights, which was the correct thing to do and also, Dassey had come to believe, the central problem. Fen was not hiding. She was on a platform station in the Thessie agricultural belt, 3 days from the nearest council relay, working a contract on a grain storage pressurization system that had been giving the local cooperative trouble for 2 seasons. She had taken the job because the cooperative paid on time, and because she liked Thessie agricultural stations. They were warm and they smelled like growing things, and the people who ran them tended to leave contractors alone to work, which she preferred. She had known the grid would lock the moment the signal went through. She had built it that way. She had also known, from the day she installed it, that she would be found eventually. You could not build something that stopped a council enforcement action and then disappear cleanly. She had not tried to disappear. She had just gone back to work, because the work was real and the waiting was not something she could do anything about, and she had never been good at doing nothing. The council officer who found her was a Drenathi named Cass, who had been given the assignment because she was known in her division as someone who was good at talking to people who did not want to be talked to, which was a reputation she had not entirely earned, but did not dispute. She arrived at the station without announcement and found Fen in the pressurization room on level 3, inside an access panel, doing something with a calibration tool that required both hands and most of her attention. Cass waited. Fen finished what she was doing, backed out of the panel and sat on the floor with her legs crossed and looked at the Drenathi officer standing in the doorway and said, "I figured it would be you people, or someone like you people. Come in, the floor's clean." Cass came in. She sat in the room's only chair, which was a low stool meant for the Thessie workers and was slightly too small for her. She asked Fen if she knew why she was here. Fen said yes. Cass asked her why she had done it. Fen thought about this in a way that suggested she had also thought about it many times before and was deciding how to say it rather than deciding what she actually believed. She said, "I had a job repairing grid infrastructure 5 years ago. I did the job correctly, and I also added something that was not in the job specification. I added it because I read the direction the council was moving, and I thought it deserved more friction." Cass asked what she meant by friction. Fen said, "Decisions that end things should be hard to make. Not impossible, hard. They should require people to be in a room together. They should require physical presence, physical action, a person with their hands on a panel saying, 'Yes, I still want this in person now.' A transmitted signal is too easy, too fast. You can vote to end something in the same amount of time it takes to vote on a trade adjustment, and those are not the same category of decision." Cass wrote this down. She asked Fen how she had gotten access to the legacy partition, without triggering the council's audit systems. Fenn said, "The audit system checks for changes to active partitions. The partition I used was marked inactive. Nothing changed in any active sector. The job record reflected the actual work I did. I completed the contracted repair fully and correctly. I just also did something additional in a space nobody was watching." Cass asked if she had known about the Veth 4 settlement when she built the lock. Fenn looked at her. She said, "The settlement on Veth 4 has been there for 4 years. I built the lock 5 years ago. I did not know about any specific settlement. I knew about the pattern." Cass asked what pattern. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Veth crawlers have a neurological response to sustained calm presence. Every xenobiologist knows it. The response takes months to trigger and requires a patience most species cannot hold in the registers that crawlers read. No researcher had been willing to stay long enough to activate it directly. Humans stay. We go quiet under threat instead of broadcasting panic, and crawlers read that as safe. The council was preparing to eliminate the one species that could sit with something unreachable, until it stopped being unreachable." She set the tool down. She said, "So I added friction." Cass looked at her notes. She looked at Fenn. She asked, not in her official voice but in the quieter one that she used when she was not sure what she was doing, "Do you think the time was used well?" Fenn said, "I don't know yet, do you?" Cass did not answer. She thanked Fenn for her time. She said that Fenn would need to come to the council station to address the body formally. She said she had a ship. Fenn said she needed to finish the pressurization calibration first, or the grain cooperative would have another bad season. She said it would take 2 more hours. Cass said she would wait. She went back out to the corridor and sat on a crate and looked at the wall and thought about the photograph of the 11 humans and the 3 Veth crawlers, which she had seen because everyone on the enforcement staff had been briefed before the vote. And she thought about what it would feel like to sit on a hostile moon and simply not leave until something enormous and armored decided you were safe. She thought it would feel like something she did not have a word for. She waited 2 hours. Fenn finished the calibration. They left. The council had emergency power running by the time Fenn arrived, and the chamber looked different under it. The usual cold blue replaced by amber that made everyone's faces seem warmer and more tired than they probably intended. Fenn walked to the center platform and looked up at 14 species looking down at her, and did not appear to find this as significant as they seemed to want her to. She had her work jacket on. She had not changed. Cass had offered her time to change, and she had said she was fine. Vorak opened by asking if she understood the gravity of what she had done. Fenn said yes. He asked her to explain her reasoning to the full council. She said, "I built a lock that creates time. I built it because termination class decisions should require a body in a room, not a signal through a wire. I built it reversible because I was not trying to override the council permanently. I was trying to make the decision harder to make than it was. And I documented it clearly because I wanted whoever found it to be able to understand it without having to guess at my intentions." Vorak asked why she believed she had the right to make that decision unilaterally. Fenn said, "I didn't decide anything about the humans. I decided something about the process. There is a difference." Silence. Paul, the Veth researcher, leaned forward from his platform. He had been quiet since the vote, which for him was unusual. He asked Fenn how she had known, 5 years ago, that the council would eventually reach a termination vote. Fenn said, "I did not know for certain. I knew the direction. I had read the internal discussion documents. I had watched the expansion metrics get cited in ways that stripped out context. I had seen the Veth 4 reports filed by independent surveyors get reclassified as sensitive. When something is being prepared for, you can usually tell from how information starts moving." Paul asked her about the Veth crawlers specifically. She said she had read his research. She named 2 of his papers by their archive reference numbers, which he had not expected. She said the contact response documentation was the most important thing in either paper, and also the thing most consistently underemphasized in how the papers were cited by others. She said that the reason humans could sit with crawlers was not mysterious if you read the neurological data carefully. It was a matter of biochemical output under stress, specifically the human tendency to suppress rather than broadcast panic signals in the presence of perceived threat, which crawlers read as non-predator status. She said most species broadcast. Humans went quiet. Not because they were not afraid, but because going quiet was a survival behavior that happened to read, to creatures with a certain kind of chemical sense, as safe. Paul said, "You understand my research better than half my colleagues." Fenn said, "I had a lot of time in transit to read." Vorak brought the session back. He asked Fenn what she wanted in exchange for restoring the grid. She said, "Nothing. The lock was never a bargaining position. It was a pause button. If the pause was used well, that is sufficient. If it was not, I cannot force anything else. I am one person with one data chip and no leverage beyond what I have already used." Vorak said, "You realize we could restore the resolution the moment the grid is back online?" Fenn said, "Yes." He said, "And you are going to give us the means to do that regardless?" She said, "Yes. Because the alternative is I hold the grid hostage, which is not what I built this to do, and it would eventually cause harm to beings who have nothing to do with the vote, and I am not willing to cause that harm. I made my argument. The time was either used or it wasn't. That's all the lock was ever for." Dasai from his platform asked a different question. He asked how many humans knew about the lock. Fenn said, "1, me." He said, "No one coordinated this with you. No human government, no activist group, no collective decision." She said, "No, I read the documents. I built the lock. I went back to work. I have not spoken to any human authority about this at any point. I was not acting on behalf of humanity. I was acting on behalf of a decision I made as an individual." The chamber was very quiet. Urin of the Thessi had not spoken during the entire session. She spoke now. She said in the slow, careful way she had of making sentences land with weight, "One person. No authority. No coordination. She read the documents, she built the lock, she went back to work." She left the next part unsaid, because the next part was already in the room. Fenn looked at her, and something passed between them that was not words. Paul was writing rapidly in his personal notes. Later, reviewing them, he would find the line he had written at that moment. This is what the crawlers already knew. He was not sure what he meant by it. He kept the line anyway. While the council chamber processed what Fenn had said, the rest of the galaxy was operating on backup systems and patience. Dasai had quietly requested that field observation teams be dispatched before Fenn arrived, specifically because he wanted the council to have something in its hands other than theory. He had framed it as standard due diligence during a grid outage. Vorak had approved it without asking too many questions, which Dasai understood as a sign that Vorak was also looking for something he could not yet name. The teams went to 6 different human-adjacent zones with instructions to observe and document. No contact, no intervention, just watch. What they brought back covered a lot of ground. In Zone 2, a human medical station had detected that a Sishari cargo vessel was running a slow atmospheric leak, the kind that took weeks to become critical, and that the Sishari crew had not yet registered on their own sensors because Sishari atmospheric tolerance ran different from the standard council range. The human station had hailed them, been ignored, hailed them again with a translated chemical diagram showing the specific gas compound drifting from their hull, been ignored a second time, and then sent a physical drone over with a patch kit and a handwritten note explaining what to do. The Sishari had accepted the drone, used the kit, and filed no acknowledgement. The human station had logged it as resolved and moved on. The team in Zone 2 asked the station administrator why they had persisted after the second non-response. The administrator, a broad-shouldered woman named Ada, said, "Because the problem did not stop being real just because they stopped responding." The team logged this and moved on. In Zone 5, something older was happening. A human xenolinguist named Brett had been living on a Kelvari research outpost for 3 years, working on a project to formally document a contact language that had developed organically between human traders and a group of semi-nomadic Kelvari who moved through the outer belt. The language had no official status. The Kelvari linguists at the outpost considered it a curiosity. Brett had been systematically cataloging it anyway: sounds, patterns, grammatical structures that appeared to be emerging from two completely different cognitive frameworks finding common ground. He had 14 volumes of notes. He had learned to sleep in 4-hour cycles because the Kelvari he was working with were most communicative in their mid-dark period, and he had adjusted his schedule to match theirs. The field officer who interviewed him asked how long he had been on the adjusted sleep schedule. Brett said about 2 years. The officer asked if that was difficult. Brett said it was for the first 3 months. Then it became normal. Things become normal if you stay with them long enough. The officer wrote this in her report without commentary, because she did not yet have commentary, only a feeling. The most significant report came from Zone 7, and it came not through official documentation, but through a Drenathi pilot named Os who had been assigned to fly the observation team, and who filed a personal addendum to the mission, record that her supervisors later considered attaching to the formal brief. Zone 7 had a debris corridor, a long sweep of dead rock and old ship fragments left over from a resource conflict 70 years ago. Council shipping lanes went around it because navigation inside it was slow and required manual attention. A human freight route cut through it, because the human pilots who ran the route had spent years mapping the specific channels and knew them well enough to use them without grid assistance. With the grid down, the debris corridor was more complicated than usual. The automated warnings that normally broadcast collision data to ships approaching the zone were offline. Os had watched from a safe distance as a human freight ship navigated the corridor manually, slower than normal, crew visible through the bridge viewport working physical charts and calling depth readings to each other out loud. It took 4 hours. The ship emerged on the other side, carrying a load of Drenathi medical supplies for a station that had placed the order 6 weeks ago and was waiting. The supplies were not urgent. There was no emergency. The human crew had simply chosen the longer, harder route through the debris corridor because it was faster than the long way around and the station was waiting. Os wrote, "I have been a pilot for 19 years. I would not have taken that route today without the grid. I watched them do it in 4 hours with paper charts and no assistance and arrive on schedule." She added, "I am not sure what I am supposed to conclude from this. I am including it because I think it is accurate, and I think accurate information is what we need right now." Her supervisor attached the addendum. Dasai read all 6 field reports in 2 hours, sitting in a side room off the main chamber corridor while Vorak was in a closed strategy session with the senior delegates. When he finished, he sat with them for a while. He thought about Ada saying the problem did not stop being real just because they stopped responding. He thought about Brett adjusting his sleep schedule for 2 years. He thought about a freight crew reading paper charts out loud to each other through 4 hours of dead rock. He thought about Fen, sitting in an agricultural station, finishing a pressurization calibration before she would leave. He thought, this is not a single person, this is not a policy, this is just how they are. He was not sure yet what to do with that. He went to find Vorak. Vorak read the field reports alone. He did not ask Dasai to walk him through them. He did not want commentary. He wanted the raw data, which he had spent his career believing was what decisions should be built from. And so, he sat in his quarters with the reports on a handheld reader and went through them one at a time in the amber emergency light. Ada and the Sishari atmospheric leak. Brett and his 14 volumes and his 2 years on an alien sleep schedule. The freight crew and the paper charts. He read each one twice, which was his habit with data that did not fit the shape he had expected. He had proposed the termination resolution because he believed the humans were a pattern that would eventually exceed the Council's capacity to manage. He still believed that. What the field reports were doing was not changing what he believed about the future. They were changing what he understood about the present. Specifically, they were introducing a variable he had not adequately weighted. That the reason humans were expanding faster than any protocol anticipated, forming contacts that no protocol covered, navigating situations that no guideline prepared them for, was not that they were careless. It was that they could not seem to stop. The Sishari had ignored 2 hails. Ada had sent the drone anyway. Brett had not been asked to learn the contact language. He had learned it because it was there to be learned. The freight crew had not been required to take the harder route. They took it because the station was waiting. He thought about the Veth-4 photograph. 11 people on a hostile moon in a circle, with creatures that had killed Drenathi settlers for 2 centuries. He had looked at that image and seen an uncontrolled variable, an unpredictable contact event, a breach of 17 different protocols. He looked at it again in his memory in the amber light and tried to see it differently. 11 people who had found a living thing that everyone else had given up on and had sat down with it anyway. He thought about what it cost to sit down with something that could kill you. He thought about how long it must have taken. He thought about what kind of species produce people who, when faced with something enormous and dangerous and unreachable, said, "I will try anyway," not as an order, not as a policy, just as the default. He sat with this for a long time. Then he called a full session. The chamber filled again under the amber light. Fen was brought back from the temporary quarters she had been assigned, still in her work jacket. She stood at the center platform without being asked. She had the data chip in her hand. Vorak said, "The Council is prepared to formally withdraw the termination resolution before the grid is restored, if you are willing to restore it." Fen said, "You don't need to withdraw it first. I told you I'm not using this as a bargaining position." He said, "I understand. I am doing it first because it is the right order." A vote was called, 13-1. Vorak voted for withdrawal. The one vote to maintain was from a Sishari delegate who had been very quiet for the entire session and who would resign their seat 4 weeks later, citing irreconcilable disagreement with the Council's direction. Fen walked with Salo to the core processor room. She inserted the chip. It took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The grid came back the way a held breath releases, all at once, quietly, every system returning to its normal state as if the whole thing had simply been resting. The holographic globe in the council chamber spun back to life. White dots, 3 sectors, human colonies, more of them than the last cycle, more than the cycle before. Vorak looked at the globe for a long time. He called one more vote before he adjourned the session. It was not on the agenda. He introduced it himself. A proposal to create a formal human advisory seat on the council, not a full delegate position, not yet, but a present and recognized voice in sessions that concerned human-adjacent space, which at the current rate of expansion meant most sessions. The debate lasted 40 minutes. It was not a quiet debate. Paul spoke at length about what the contact response data from Veth-4 suggested about the long-term possibility of human-facilitated relations with species the Council had written off as uncontactable. Dasai spoke about Brett's 14 volumes. Urin said only, "We already knew what we needed to know, and we almost made a decision we could not undo. Let us not do that again." 11-3 in favor. They asked Fen if she would take the seat. She said she was a contractor, not a diplomat, and that they probably wanted someone better suited. Dasai said, "We have enough diplomats. We have a shortage of people who finish the job and go back to work." She thought about it for a moment. She said she had 2 active contracts she would need to complete first. The council said it could wait. She completed both contracts. She took the seat. On the first day she attended a full session. She brought her calibration tools in her bag because she had a maintenance job to get to afterward, and she planned to go straight from the chamber. Nobody mentioned it. Paul, watching her from across the ring, wrote one line in his notes. This is exactly what the crawlers already knew. This time he was sure what he meant.